Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone. My name's Jasmine Burns, and I'm on the board of the Charleston Literary Festival. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the College of Charleston Alumni Association. I'm delighted to introduce our two distinguished speakers, Dr. Tiya Miles and Dr. Shannon Eaves. Our guest author, Dr. Miles, was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. She holds a degree in Afro-American Studies from Harvard University, a master's in Women's Studies from Emory University, and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. She taught on the faculty of the University of Michigan for 16 years and is also the recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. Currently, Dr. Miles is a professor of history at Harvard University and a Radcliffe alumni professor at Harvard University. She is a public and academic historian and creative writer whose work explores the intersection of African American, Native American, and women's histories. She offers coursework on African American women, Native American women, abolitionist women, and Black Indian histories and identities. Dr. Miles is the author of several books to include The Dawn of Detroit and The Ties That Bind, that won many awards and accolades. Her latest book, and the subject of today's program, is titled All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, which is deeply tied to the Low Country. This book has won many prestigious awards, and just to name a few, it won the 2021 National Book Award for Nonfiction and made the top 10 best books of the year by publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Slate. Dr. Eaves, Shannon Eaves, is the Assistant Professor of African American History at the College of Charleston. She earned her PhD in history from UNC. Her scholarship specializes in 19th century US history, African American history, and slavery and gender in the antebellum South. Her current project, Sexual Violence and American Slavery, The Making of a Rape Culture in the Antebellum South, will soon be to press. I'm very excited for this program today, and I know that you will enjoy the conversation between these two phenomenal women. And with that, I'll hand it off to our speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tiya Miles. I'm really happy to be here with you this afternoon. This theater is gorgeous. I have walked by it several times, but never been inside, so I feel that this is a great double treat to be in this space. So I have been told that I have about 15 minutes to talk with you about my book before we move into a conversation. This is going to be a little bit tough for me, so I have my phone here to try to keep me honest about the time. And what I hope to do is share a few slides with you, some images, give you an overview and a sense of my book, All That She Carried, and then to read a passage about Charleston, because one thing that I have found very fascinating since the book has come out is a number of people have written to me or come up to me at events and said that they had been to Charleston before, or they'd always wanted to go to Charleston, and now they see the city in an entirely new way. They were seeing the hidden architecture, the hidden meanings and histories behind the landscape. And this is something that I think was very fascinating for me about the research for this book that I'd like to read a bit to you about. All right, so my book is about a bag. It's about an antique bag, and you're seeing the back of it here on the slide. This bag now has a name that was given to it by curators over at the Middleton Place Foundation and Plantation. But for most of its history, it was just a material object. It was just a thing. It was an item that was cherished by a single family, but that wasn't known by the museum community, by historians, by anthropologists, by archaeologists, and by the public. I didn't know about this bag until a strange circumstance and tip led me to want to investigate it. I was actually down in Savannah several years ago for a conference about the environmental issues that have characterized and that are currently challenging the southeastern coastline. So there were lots of folks from South Carolina there, North Carolina, Georgia. And I gave a presentation about hauntings on the Georgia coast and the ways in which those hauntings have been traced by the people who live in those communities and traced in the African American oral history to histories of enslavement in the area. And after my very unusual talk about ghosts and hauntings at an environmental conference, I got to chat with a number of people and noticed there was a man standing, off to the side who was an older white gentleman wearing a baseball cap. He stood there for a long time. He waited for the area to clear from people that I was talking with. And I was kind of eyeing him, wondering, why is he still there? What does he want to say to me? And he was kind of eyeing me. And afterwards, when we could be, alone in this space to talk, he came up and he said, "Do you know about Ashley Sack?" I had never heard of Ashley Sack at that time, and I told him I didn't know what this thing was. And he looked at me with very earnest eyes, with a very intense gaze, and he said, "You have to see it." That night, I got to my hotel room and saw that this gentleman had already sent me an email message with an image of the sack. And it turned out that he was a local journalist in Savannah. He had previously been a marine biologist before retiring. He was very interested in histories of the southeastern coast and in cultural experiences. And he saw some kind of synergy, some kind of connection between my research and my talk on ghosts and hauntings and the ephemeral and this sack. When he sent me the image, I could see it on my iPad, and I was completely astonished, and I decided that I wanted to try to see it in person. The sack was owned, and still is, by the Middleton Place Foundation, and I wanted to see it there, but as luck, or I don't know, perhaps misfortune would have it, it was gone when I went, because it was on loan to the Smithsonian. It was on loan to the new African American Museum of History and Culture in DC, and the museum wasn't open yet, so the sack was in storage. This meant that I had to wait, I don't even know how many months, certainly 6 months, maybe it was even a year, before I could see the sack in person. But finally, I was able to see it in person in the museum, and I was very fortunate to be able to spend time in the museum alone because the curators were generous enough to let me in early before it opened. And so I got to be in the presence of this thing in solitude, and it was just incredibly arresting and moving and saddening. And I decided then that even though the research that I had been doing over those several months was not really bearing fruit about the origin of this sack or the history of this sack, that I would have to write a book about it, because there seemed to be no other choice, given how incredible and how meaningful this object was. This is the DC Museum where the sack was on exhibit when I first saw it. And at that time, it was in the subterranean gallery that interprets enslavement at the museum. Has anybody been to that museum here? Okay, lots of people. I'm so glad. If you haven't gone yet and you have the chance, I highly recommend it. It's a really stunning experience, in part because the architecture of the building works in tandem with the histories and cultures that are being interpreted there. So enslavement, the history of slavery, is interpreted below ground with all of the emotion and the weight that that entails. And when you rise up in the building on the elevator, you see the years ticking by and you're moving from slavery to freedom. It's really incredible. And when I saw the sack on exhibit there, it was next to an actual auction block where enslaved people had been sold. This is one of the flanker buildings at Middleton Plantation. I see some people nodding, probably a familiar sight to several folks in the room. And this is a location which I uncovered after doing the research, both primary research and original firsthand materials, and secondary research and published articles on the sack. It turns out that this old sack was owned by a woman named Rose, and that Rose was most likely enslaved by the couple who lived in this house in Charleston. The couple owned many more pieces of land and structures besides this house, but this was the location where more than likely all evidence suggests that Rose herself would have been enslaved. Also enslaved, more than likely, by this same couple was the young girl named Ashley. And Ashley is the person for whom the sack is named. Those of you who don't know the story yet are perhaps starting to get a sense of what I'm going to share with you about this sack and its meaning. Rose somehow learned or realized that Ashley was about to be sold. And this was right after Robert Martin, who had been the owner of this estate, died, and his will called for his wife to basically liquidate many of his property holdings so that she could then distribute cash to all of their children. So at that time, Rose somehow learned that Ashley was going to be sold away, and she got a hold of the sack that you have already seen the back of and began to pack it with several items. She packed it with a dress, a braid of her own hair, pecans, and her love. And here are some examples of the kinds of material things that Rose packed for her daughter in advance of their momentous parting. Clothing, hair from an African-American family that was saved in a Bible. Pecans, which ended up being a very important food staple to indigenous peoples and also to African-American people. And this is the photograph I like to use for love. I don't really know how to capture love in an image, but this photograph shows a community of enslaved people in South Carolina. And we have to imagine it, but I believe that we can have faith in our imagining that the people in this group had to have loved one another in order to be able to survive. So here's the front of the sack that I have been withholding from you for these moments. And this is the most important source that exists about the history of this material artifact and of Rose and of Ashley. The sewn inscription reads, "My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her it be filled with my love, always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1921. Every time I read that, I feel it. It's so beautiful. It's just so sad. It's heartbreaking. This story of a mother and child's forced separation was cherished, remembered, and passed down through the family. The embroidery was made by a descendant, Ruth Middleton, and she finished the embroidery in 1921, right after she herself became the mother of a daughter who was born free. This is a transcript. It's a little bit easier to read the words here. This is another image of the sack. You can see it, how long it is by looking at the roll at the top. And so my book, All That She Carried, starts with the sack, and it tells the story of the object and tells the story of the women and the girls, of the family line, of their movement across time and their movement across space. And it starts here in Charleston. So I'm a little bit over the time that I was allotted, but I'm not doing too badly. So I am going to read you at least a little bit of this passage about Charleston. I really want to share it with you. This is a section called A Rose by Any Other Name, and I titled it that because there are actually a number of roses in the archival record of South Carolina, women named Rose who were enslaved. So it's very, very difficult to pinpoint a single woman named Rose. So the section is called A Rose by Any Other Name, and I started the search for her in Charleston. Charleston was once and is still Carolina's Emerald City, a crown jewel on the southeastern Atlantic coastline. On the foundation of slave-grown rice, the earliest low-country planters here secured economic, racial, social, and cultural prominence, and maintained that status for generations that followed. In the early decades of the 1800s, around the time when Rose was born, tourism to Charleston was already a popular pastime. Visitors eagerly tarried in this sparkling city. The scenes these travelers recounted in diaries and letters usually included unfree people like Rose in the frame, a recognition, if unconscious, of the fundamental and compelled role that African Americans played in building and maintaining this exclusive society. Harriet Martineau, a British writer on an American tour in the 1830s, fell into blissful reverie over the Charleston cityscape despite her anti-slavery views. From the top of a church steeple opposite the guardhouse, where soldiers kept watch for slaves out of line, Martineau gazed out at the glistening rooftops, rivers, and bay, and she wrote, quote, "The city was spread beneath us in a fan-like form in streets converging towards the harbor. The heat and moisture of the climate give to the buildings the hue of age, so as to leave nothing of the American air of spruceness in the aspect of the place. The sandy streets, the groups of mulattoes, the women with turbaned heads, surmounted with water pots and baskets of fruit, the small panes of the house windows, the yucca bristling in the gardens below us, and the hot haze through which we saw the blue main and its islands, all look so oriental as to strike us with wonder," end quote. To hear Martineau tell it, Charleston was a kaleidoscope for the senses, foreign in nature, awash as it was in aged splendor and, quote, exotic color, courtesy of enslaved people. From the fruit they grew, to the plants they tended, to the textiles wrapped around their heads. The very sediment that upheld the chapel where Martineau took in the view would not have existed without slave labor. And I'm just going to stop there. That gives you a sense of the way in which I try to contextualize Charleston and offer a different lens for people to see it as I locate Rose and her daughter, Ashley, on this urban landscape. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all and to share this conversation that I am about to have with Dr. Tiya Miles. Dr. Miles, I have been such an admirer of your work, and you did not disappoint with this book. I felt joy and sorrow and sadness and just the whole spectrum, sometimes having visceral reactions, to the, not only what I can't even imagine, would be the experiences of these women, but also the silence around these women and the ways in which we as historians have to work so hard to try to give light to such a resilient group of people. And so I want to start off by talking about the title. And I'm in the process of finishing my first book, and it's interesting how you have ideas about titles, and then people point out to you all the ways in which those ideas are not good. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really curious about your title, and which is All That She Carried, and I want to pay particular attention to the word she in the title. You approach Ashley Sack as a testament to enslaved women's lives and experiences and expressions of love and hope. And it would have been perfectly logical for Ashley Sack to be in the title, but rather it's in the subtitle, and you chose for the title to be All That She Carried. And so I want to ask, who is the literal and figurative she who you are drawing our attention to in the title? And was it a conscious choice to lead with the word she rather than, focus on the sack itself?
Oh my goodness. What a gift you have just given me. What a gift. In sharing your reactions to the book, which I so greatly appreciate, because the emotions that you described are feelings that I had as well in doing the research and in doing the writing, and as you can see and as I shared every time I return to the material. And it is a complex mix of emotions. There certainly is sorrow. I mean, there is sorrow, especially as a mother and as someone who has a very difficult time separating out this sense of what has happened in the past and what's happening in the present. I mean, I think that for me, partly because I'm so steeped in the history, maybe this is the case for you too, partly because I have an imaginative bent. I've also written fiction about slavery. I can be deeply immersed in the materials, and I can feel like it's 1850. And I have had to make myself stop and look out my window to remind myself that actually it's 20, whatever the date was at the time when I was writing this, 2018-ish. And this is not the past, this is the present. so those emotions are difficult to contend with. But the joy lives in the spaces of survival. It lives in the spaces of resistance. It lives in the spaces of beauty that this sack represents. It lives in the fact that we are here, which means our ancestors survived this.
Amen.
And I feel that it's just essential to everybody's well-being on any side of this history, no matter who your ancestors were, what they did or didn't do, that we remember both the wrongs and the perseverance, that we remember both the pain and the joys. So your question about the title was incredibly astute. And I think that you caught me. You caught what I was up to. Not many people catch what I'm up to in that title. She is the pronoun I chose because I wanted to have a title that was expansive. And she is all of the women in the family. So she is Rose and Ashley and Ruth, and Ruth's mother, Rosa, who isn't named in the sack, but who comes up in the records. She is all of the enslaved women whose experiences I was able to bring into the interpretation because of their narratives or their letters, their as told to stories. And she is also the sack itself. She is the sack who became personified in my mind as I thought about the importance of this sack to the family. I'd like to attach a footnote to that, which is to tell you that my first idea for this title was the things she carried, still leading into the she as being expansive. And I remembered reading Tim O'Brien way back in school and thinking about the Vietnam War and the ways in which slavery was an experience of war, how it was a constant battle for people to steal others' humanity and for people to maintain their humanity. That my editor said, people will be confused. they will think that maybe it's about the Vietnam War or something like this. And so I had to go back to the drawing board, and I ended up being able to move some words around and come up with this title. And I stuck all the other keywords in the subtitle, so it has quite a long subtitle.
Thank you for that. And next, I have a reflection and a question. And, I was so struck by these words in your introduction. You said, quote, "This family story is about the resourcefulness of women and girls, even the most marginalized and maligned of them. It illustrates how the overburdened of the world can persist through unanticipated hardship. And this story suggests how instructive memories of perseverance from the past can be, especially when fastened to things that serve as aids of recall and connection." And I was also, and so reading that quote and then also reading your description of your great aunt Margaret and her quilt, this instantly made me think about my paternal grandmother's handmade quilts that my mom would pull out in the wintertime. And, my father's family is from Barnwell, South Carolina, and, their story is not that different from many other African Americans in Barnwell. They were poor sharecroppers who often had to take their 11 children from house, tenant house to tenant house, and just flow with the work. And she and her sisters would gather and make quilts out of whatever scraps that they could find. And my dad would often tell me these, share what for him were very fond memories of watching his mom and her sisters, make these quilts. And as a child, when my mom would pull out these quilts, especially for my cousins and I, we'd have to make pallets and sleep on the floor, on these quilts. And I can remember feeling a little embarrassed by these old quilts because, they didn't have pretty designs and they didn't have a matching color scheme, and there were places where with age the seams had come loose, and and in the present I can I actually can conjure up feelings of shame about that embarrassment that I felt at that time. But now I see these quilts through a different lens, and I think about as my parents transition the idea of those quilts being in my home, and what they'll mean for me and the stories that I will tell the future generations of our family about that. And now I see them as of course they reflect my family's poverty, but they also symbolize my grandmother's talent to turn scraps into warmth and love and shelter for her family. And so again, I'm no longer embarrassed but amazed by her ingenuity. And so this is what your work did for me. It helped me to just go through just to sit down and kind of think about what are some of my own family heirlooms and how has my relationship to them changed over time. And so I'm curious, have people been inspired to share their family histories with you as a result of reading this book?
I'm so touched by what you said. So touched by what you said. That's a beautiful story, Shannon. The short answer is yes. The book has been inspiring lots of people, and I'm so moved by it. Absolutely moved by it. There have been people who have been having basically sewing groups, making groups, get together, read the book, and work on a project they've already started, or work on something new that they're sewing or crocheting or knitting. There's been people who have done community reads, and over the course of the time reading the book, they have brought in artifacts, keepsakes, tokens from their families to discuss them. A number of people have sent me images of the things that were important to them and their family. It's just really incredible items. And I'm not sure if you saw this, but the New York Times is doing a project on heirlooms. And there was a very large article and curated set of photographs that were published in June, for Juneteenth, connected to this project. And it's basically a series of African-American photographers taking pictures of themselves and family members with cherished keepsakes, and some writing that I did with the co-author to reflect on what it is that those photographers decided to show. And that project invited everyone to submit their own photographs of keepsakes and a story to the New York Times. This will be a continuing series. So I think that partly the book, but really maybe more the times that we're living in, which feel so unstable and uncertain, so divisive, is leading people to want to go back to some of those more traditional arts and crafts, and to feel that they have some control over being able to touch something, make something, care for something, mend something, and gift it to someone else, and that they can connect those actions and those items to family histories or community histories that are important to them.
Yeah, I love photographs, old photographs, so I will definitely have to check this project out. And speaking of photographs and objects, I love how in this book you include so many different voices and disciplines. It is definitely an interdisciplinary work, and histories. And in telling the story, you include slave narratives, works of fiction, material culture, embroidery, horticulture, conjuring even. And in that way, this isn't a traditional history, which you state so beautifully, in the introduction. I was like, I need to take notes of how to write an introduction. It really was masterful. And so your application of what you call a Black feminist historical methods, Marisa Fuentes and Saidiya Hartman, allow for a more expansive and inclusive perspective when investigating enslaved lives. And so the question is, why is this approach so critical in allowing you to tell this story?
So that's a question about really sources and methods and the approach one might take to work on a project like this. And the first thing I should say about it is that the approach I took really came from the object itself. So if I had a written narrative that was detailed and extensive and told me all the ins and outs and twists and turns of this family's life, I would have written a very different book, because I would have had a central piece of evidence, a central source that was written, that was a document. And I think I would have probably fallen back into my more familiar habits, probably your more familiar habits, the ways that we are right, exactly, taught to investigate historical questions. I would have gone to the archives, I would have located more documents, and I would have read them. But I didn't have that. I had this, a thing, quite a mysterious thing at the time. And starting from the sack really left me no other choice but to try to be creative around the sources and the approaches. And I tried to let the sack be my guide, because one thing that I found to be very important in the interpretation was centering Rose as a thinking, feeling, historical actor. Too often individuals who do not have ample sources that they have created themselves or sources that exist about them are left to the sidelines of historical interpretation, or they are described or written about as, kind of shadow people with no real shape to their lives, with no interiority, with no sense of their motivations or intentions. And that would have been just an egregious, an awful, disrespectful way to try to approach a history about this incredible woman, Rose, who did something that I know I would never have had the foresight to do. That is, she knew she was about to lose her child, and instead of just, collapsing into herself or giving up or falling into total despair, she decided to try to protect that child into the future by doing what she could. And I think at the time, it must have felt like it wasn't very much. All she could do was get this bag and put some things in it that she had and give it to her daughter. But I think that the inscription, the embroidery, tells us that what Rose did was actually heroic. It enabled Ashley's survival. Ashley would go on to have children of her own. Those children would go on to have full lives in the North. And so starting with that respect for Rose and starting with the sack meant that I had to turn to other Black women's voices to try to make sense of it, because those were the closest experiences to Rose's and to Ashley's. And in terms of the use of contemporary Black feminist scholarship to understand what was happening with this history, that was necessary because Black women who have studied slavery have really carved out a set of methods for doing this work in the context of very sparse sources. And it is on the shoulders of generations of particularly Black women scholars who've confronted the scarcity of these archives that we stand. And so they, of course, had to be people who I could think with and converse with on the page as I interpreted this history.
So I have to follow up that response with this particular question. This is a quote from Bell Hooks. In African American life, Black women have been love practitioners. This is the epigraph of the introduction of your book. This is a simple yet very profound statement. And so what does it mean for Black women to be love practitioners?
Mm-hmm. The notion that this book had to be about love is one that I came to gradually over time. When I embraced it, it was because of the reason I just spoke about a moment ago, about how important it was to respect Rose, to start with the source, and then to work my way through adjacent materials that were produced by or told by people who had similar experiences. Thank you. So if we look at the sack, we can see how prominent the word love is. It's right there in the middle. It's in big red letters. That line told me that love had to be central to this book. But for months and maybe even years, I resisted that. And I'm not proud of it. I'm not proud of the fact that I resisted it. The reason why I resisted it was because love seems too easy to me. It seemed too easy to think, oh, I'm going to write a book. It's going to be about mothers who loved their daughters. Because those kinds of emotions, they're so overproduced and overdetermined in our culture that I worried that I wouldn't be saying something that was really getting to the depth of this history. So I avoided it for a long time. But then I came back to my primary source, which was this sack, and this sack was telling me that love was central. Ruth Middleton chose to highlight it in every way she could, right? It's the biggest word. It's in the only red line. It's in the middle of her embroidery. And she received this story from women in her family. This line is a quote, which we can tell because right before it, we have the words told her, set apart. We can almost imagine the quotation marks that were intended to go around that line, which is sewn in red. And Ruth Middleton was a very committed member to her church in Philadelphia. She would have seen Bibles with Jesus' words put in red. I don't think there's any question that this was a quote that she had remembered from the stories passed down in her family. So to not send her love would mean not respecting this experience of these women, and it would mean not really attending closely to what the source was telling me. Once I knew the book had to be about love, I started looking for love in the secondary material. And this is where Bell Hooks' quotation comes in. Bell Hooks, an incredibly sharp cultural critic, Black feminist theorist who passed away not so long ago, has a series of books on love. And I highly recommend them if you'd like to read some inspiring books that aren't particularly long. In one of these books on love, she has this wonderful line that you quoted about Black women being love practitioners. When I read that, I felt like, that's it. That's exactly what Rose was, exactly what Rose was doing. She was a practitioner of love. She was a maker of love. She was a doer of love. She was someone who activated and actualized love in her life. And what Rose did was not singular to her. So maybe, and it looks like, she's the only person that we know of right now who packed a sack in exactly this way, whose descendants embroidered the story onto the surface of the bag. This is a very unusual artifact. But Rose was not the only Black woman who practiced love through action. It was a shared experience among Black women during the period of enslavement and after. And so this notion of Black women being love's practitioners really just means that in African American experience and history, Black women have tended to be the ones who acted love out in their daily lives and thereby sustained their families and communities.
I have so many questions that I want to ask you, but we do have limited time. So I'm going to let this be my last question before I turn to the audience and give you all an opportunity to ask some questions of your own. So what was the most challenging topic to explore when you were writing this book? And not just in terms of the area that was perhaps the furthest away from your expertise, but maybe even, emotionally, psychologically, what did you find to be most difficult?
Well, I've already spoken a bit about what it was like to be a mother of, at the time, young children while working on this book. It was very difficult. There was an emotional price to pay while doing the work. And I hear this from other African American women who work on slavery, and I hear this from people from all kinds of backgrounds who read the book or who read other works on slavery, that the taking of children is just the most heart-rending thing that they could contemplate. I remember hearing from a white man who he and his wife had adopted 2 Asian children, and he wrote me talking about how reading this book made him think about the mother of the children that he and his wife had adopted in a way that he'd never had before. So that was very difficult. But I will say that equally difficult was writing about the topic that you're working on, and that is the sexual assault enslaved women and girls. That was very, very hard, because even though we know what happened, and even though we know it actually was common, reading firsthand accounts of Black women who talk about what happened to them, oh my goodness. That'll set you back in a life, right? That will set you back. It's difficult to read those accounts and stop your mind from spinning into the abyss of the trauma and the tragedy of it, let alone go and then write a page about it. So in the section where I write most about that, during the process of doing the work, I actually had a very strange experience, which is as I was writing, I lost a sense of being the person in the chair writing. You all have heard people talk about the flow experience, or the sense of lost time when you're really in deep focus. That's where I was in those sections. I really was not there in terms of, here I am at my desk, I'm gonna have a sip of my coffee. And I think that I really could not be fully there for those sections.
I almost feel like I don't want to end on that question, and I feel like I need to give you an opportunity to answer what will now be my last question.
Okay.
You frame Ashley's sack as a type of emergency pack from Rose to her daughter on the eve of their separation. And so as you dove into this project, what was in your emergency pack to help you navigate the heaviness of this story?
You've done it again. you have done it again. So people do ask me about the emergency pack line, but no one's ever asked me that. I think that the supports that I have in my life that have been consistent in the past were also important to me while working on the book. And really, those supports are my own family, and they are my friends and colleagues who do similar work. My mother is a person who I always call when I feel stuck or when I feel like I can't go on. And she told me, when I first called her, I think the very first call I made to my mother about this work was when I was writing my dissertation. And I called her from the Newberry Library. And in that instance, I had just come across a description of whipping techniques that Cherokees, indigenous peoples, used on enslaved Black people. And I was very distraught about this for a number of reasons. And I didn't know what to do but to call my mother. And she told me then, and it's shocking to think what happened years ago, that was a long time ago. She told me then that she understood how I was feeling, but she needed to make sure that I understood that I wasn't doing this work because I chose it. I wasn't doing this work because I wanted to. I was doing this work for the ancestors. My mother told me that, and I felt that it was such a gift. She told me the purpose of my work. I hadn't realized it. She explained to me why I was doing it when I'm somebody who, I can barely watch a film about slavery. I have not watched many of them because I just cannot take it. No. She helped it make sense for me. And she still does that. I have called her from Charleston, by the way, you all. I've called her from my research sessions here too.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been such a delight. So I want to give our audience an opportunity to be able to ask you some questions. So if you have a question, please stand and a microphone will be delivered to you. Please stand.
First of all, thank you. The book is beautiful.
Thank
And I don't know if I can ask the question without crying. You give in your book, you call Rose a visionary, and you call Ashley a survivor, and you call Ruth a storyteller. And you haven't addressed any of that today, but I'm wondering, Ashley and Ashley's daughter also had a characteristic because they cared about these things that were given to them. And I do history research too, and I sometimes come to people who they don't see the value in the heirlooms, and so they toss them. And so can you speak to anything that you found about how they felt about maintaining this heirloom, this precious heirloom through time?
Thank you. Thank you for your words about the book, and thank you for the question. What you said about the descriptions that I gave to each woman in the book, I really appreciated that you noticed that, because it took me a long time to try to figure out how I might characterize each woman with one word. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to connect them with a characteristic that might enable people to see them in a clear way as individuals, as real individual women and girls, as opposed to being just, members of a big mass of Black people in a cotton field, for example. So I thought very hard about what each woman's major role seemed to have been during her time with the SAC. And that's why I thought of Rose as the visionary. She had the vision to try to care for her daughter through the use of these objects. And Ashley is the survivor because she's the one who not only survived herself through using the sack, but she made sure the sack survived. And Ruth is a storyteller because without Ruth, we would know nothing about this. The question that you asked about how they may have felt about tending the object and caring for it over time is a question that I wish I could answer. But these women, as far as we know, as far as any extant records might say, did not talk about or write down or record how they felt about that. We don't have the firsthand account from them of their view of what it meant to have this sack. But we do have the sack itself, and we can read the material item for clues about how they may have felt about it. And the very first slide that I showed, the very first slide that I showed, you may recall, it was the back of the sack. And I don't know if you noticed, but there, oh my goodness, that was like magic.
It magically appeared.
Oh my goodness, thank you for that. So do you see where there are tears in the fabric? They've been patched. And this tells us something about how they felt about this object, that they cared enough to notice when it was damaged and to try to mend it. And we also know they passed it down, which suggests that they cherished it. And something that occurred to me very late in the process of working on the book, when I was thinking a lot about Ruth and her lifestyle and her sewing and the fact that she was somebody who was written up in the Black newspapers of her time in Philadelphia as always wearing the most fashionable clothes. I mean, this Ruth Middleton, apparently was a very, very stylish woman in Philadelphia. When I was thinking about her and her sense of style and her sewing, I really thought a lot about how she cared for this textile as an heirloom. And I just looked at the sack, and I looked at it, and I stared at it, and I stared at it. And it seemed to me that there's a stripe of discoloration toward an upper portion of the sack, which I speculate may have been where Ruth had it hanging in her home. I can't prove that, but again, thinking about her interest in textile, her interest in fabric and sewing and fashion, and looking at that color distortion on the thing itself led me to think it's quite possible that she actually, showed off the other side, showed off the front of her embroidery in her home.
If anyone else has a question, you're welcome to stand.
Also trying not to cry, but you've talked a lot about its past and where it will be in the museum. I was curious what's your perspective on its present, and where do you see it having impact moving forward? Have you thought about, now that it's in the museum, where will it go next, and have you thought about the journey it will continue on and inspire generationally?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. So I'm going to take the end first. You mentioned the generations, and one thing that I did not say in my comments or in our conversation is that lineal descendants of this family have not been found. There must be some cousins, and there's an anthropologist named Mark Auslander who has said that he's in touch with some descendants. I am not sure who those individuals are. I hope that he will be able to plan an event, in their honor in the future. I know he had been working on that, a few years ago. But the generations of this family seem to not have continued, at least in a lineal sense. But that doesn't mean that there aren't generations. This is one thing that I talk about in the book. that there are so many ways to identify oneself with a certain set of ancestors, and so many ways to be a descendant and to be an inheritor. Families can be defined, in an expansive sense, including, adoptive kin. I just mentioned the case of adoption earlier. And there's such a thing as cultural ancestry and cultural inheritance as well. So especially now that the SAC is owned by foundations and traveling to museums, I see it as being an inheritance that we all share and that we all share responsibility for, in terms of making sure that it continues to be cared for and making sure that the story that it is testimony to and of is not only heard, but reckoned with. From what I understand from the Middleton Place Foundation, the SAC is already no longer on site there because it's going to be on display in the new Charleston, is it International African American Museum? Yes, so it's going to be on display there very soon, so people will be able to see it in that context.
No, that's great. Maybe we have time for one more question. Right there. Oh.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your work, and I haven't read the book, but I look forward to digging into it today. A lot of the conversation, both in moderation and your reflections on the process and the work that went into completing the book really gave me pause. I am the daughter of Jim Crow refugees. My father is from this area, and I wanted to ask you a question, and not having read the book, but understanding some of its central themes. For those, did you have any reflections about women, Black women specifically, perhaps descendants of the enslaved, who don't have a SAC? I guess what I'm asking is that a lot of it's so difficult for some of us to make connections with our ancestry. Mm-hmm. And though we do have family and folklore and tales, some things like that, many of us don't have a SAC that connect us to our history. Did you reflect on perhaps other iterations or other ways the SAC could manifest in our shared experiences?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. I think you answered the question as you were asking the question. So what I'm going to say to you is what you have just said, to me and all of us. I did think about the Great Migration in its different phases and the relationship of African Americans to the things that they had possessed in the rural South. And it occurred to me that I hadn't really seen that notion considered before, that when masses of people move, especially when they move under duress because of terrible conditions, living conditions, working conditions, political conditions, they leave many things behind, which means that our ancestors who went from southern rural areas to southern cities, southern rural areas to northern cities and western cities, couldn't take everything with them. I mean, it's a marvel, and again, it tells us something about how they cared for the SAC, that this textile was brought north with the family. There would have been many things that had to have been left behind, and I think that is a loss because the things that our family can care for and pass down do help us to remember them. They do help us to think about, who made that, or where did she get that, or under what circumstances, or what was the story that he used to tell me when he would take this out. And so it is a great loss, that migration under those conditions of stress and emergency has meant a separation of people from some things that they may have cherished. And this sack is very unusual because it's not just an object, but it's also a text of its own because the story is stitched onto it. As far as I know right now, there's nothing else quite like this. I looked pretty hard. If anybody else finds anything like it, I would really appreciate it if you would let me know. But this means that most of us do not have a sack, or certainly a sack like this, that can help to answer some of the questions that we crave, that we want so badly to know about our ancestors. I have ancestry in South Carolina, but I am having a very difficult time identifying their exact names in the records. And I've done this a few times before. So many of us don't have that knowledge that we crave. We don't have those physical things that would help us to feel that we were able to draw especially close to our ancestors. But we do have many of the things that you just articulated in your question. We do have our oral culture, we have our stories, we have our songs. We do have the relationships that people still enjoy within families and across families, and we have the memories that are brought forth when people get together and talk about their family members who may have passed on. One of the things that I want to do in the book was to show that we also have food. We have recipes. And these dishes, these favorite foods, these meals are a tangible presence with us today of our ancestors and the things that they maybe enjoyed to eat or the things that they had to eat because they were not given the kind of nutritious food that they deserved. But these meals that we do have today are also material culture items that can help us to remember. And we can make things. We can reproduce things in the past. A number of people have sent me actual pieces of fabric, sometimes on old sacks, where they have done the embroidery themselves. They've redone Ruth's story themselves. And other people have written me saying that they were attempting to replicate an old item that their family had, but that was falling apart, an old textile item, an old quilt, for example. And so we can make things based on our memories and our stories that can help us to hold on to them. We also have practices, cultural practices. A lot of us have church or festivals, celebrations, reunions, and these are all ways that we can have those people we cared about from our deep past with us in the present.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miles and Dr. Eaves, for that moving and intimate conversation. And thank you all for being here and for your support. We'll have books for sale in the lobby, and Dr. Miles will be signing some books. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks.